Hello, friends. It's Chapo.
Background as a sort of environmentalist. He talks about ending the extraction economy, ending dependence on oil. He's even attacked Venezuela, talking about like they represent the politics of death because oil is the politics of death. The reality is, and I should say that this, Petro and people like Gabriel Boric in Chile, this sort of new wave of leftist presidents, they definitely define themselves against some of the old pink tide of people like Chavez, Evo Morales, etc. And the reality is that I don't think this kind of discourse is going to work. I don't think it's going to happen, at a basic level, because one, Gustavo Petro and Gabriel Boric have been elected at a time of a global energy crisis and shortage. Two, the consequences of gas prices going up even by 1 cent in Latin America are incredibly serious. If you think that it's bad news for Joe Biden politically that gas prices are going up in Latin America, the capital city.
No,
would
that's when
already
you have
be
like
burnt
people in the
down.
streets. You have thousands of people in your capital city, like turning over cars.
The
And
capital
stuff.
city
Yeah.
burns down. It's not even a left or right thing. It's not about this. Oh, the left here is more organized than that left. No, if gas prices go up, it's just a general uprising of the population, incredibly violent uprising of the population. No one really survives that. Everyone who's attempted to withdraw subsidies, for example, for gas prices, has either ended up being overthrown or had to just walk it back after like a few days because it's the most sensitive issue in the country. These are people farm, in rural communities who, earning nothing and having to pay like an extra dollar a day for gas that destroys people. So no one will accept that. Um, this discourse from people like Gabriel Boric and Gustavo Petro. If you look at who they are, where they come from, they're very different to people like Chavez and Evo Morales. Chavez and Evo Morales came from working class areas and rural areas. They knew what it was like to struggle. Whereas people like Gabriel Boric, Gustavo Petro, they come from much more middle class backgrounds, academic backgrounds, and this sort of politics is quite only exists in Latin America amongst these sorts of academic, university, student circles, middle class people who live in big cities and don't know what it's like to be in rural areas and have to depend on gas for everything you do, depend on gas to, cut down bananas, with things like this. And we see it play out in pretty much every country. Here in Bolivia, for example, just last year, a new sort of gas fields were discovered, new gas reserves. Everyone was jumping for joy. No one was thinking about the environment. The only people who are now trying to organize protests against the exploration there are sort of right-wing, middle-class groups in big cities, talking about the environment, whereas the whole of the left, working class, unions, indigenous organizations, people are just desperate to find these new sources of income, but precisely because they're going to be owned by the state. And that's the other side of Gustavo Petro and Gabriel Boric's discourse against extraction, is I think is going to come down to be an excuse to not nationalize natural resources. Because the discourse would be, well, we don't want our economy to be based on this, so we're not going to nationalize it. And so we're not going to see the kind of transformations that we saw in the old pink tide. And it's a shame. I think the new sort of quote unquote pink tide leaders, they should be adding to the legacy of the first wave rather than taking away. So, Boric, Petro, they're very good on things such as LGBT issues or feminism, etc., better than some of the older leaders. But there should be an evolution, I think, would mean adding that rather than taking away some of the politics around nationalization, around sovereignty, national sovereignty, around standing up to the United States. So I think it's a shame that they define themselves against some of that legacy.
And yeah, this is something I remember from our last conversation, at least as regards to Bolivia, is that for building like left wing movements or successful mass political parties and exercising like true political power, you can't really do that with like a sort of like standard Western liberal environmentalist agenda. Like you can't stand up to the powers of like Western neoliberal capitalism by not developing and nationalizing the resources that your country has to offer. and like you can't like you can't really it's a shame, but like you can't stop like West like imperialism from dominating your countries by saving the rainforest. It's just a question of like who is exploiting those resources and for what and for to whose benefit. Is it to the benefit of like multinational Western corporations that are just sort of pillaging and poisoning the country, or is it going to be done by the people, like the state itself, for the benefit of the people in these countries?
Yeah, you see a lot of, today in sort of Western sort of leftist academic circles about degrowth, right? Everyone's talking about degrowth. Of course, I'd say degrowth for who? Because I'm talking to you from Bolivia, and where I see a lot more growth is needed, a lot more roads, a lot more hospitals, a lot more schools, electricity. Then it needs to extend the electricity infrastructure for people, extend access to energy, etc. There needs to be growth rather than degrowth, and that word would be quite alien to most people in the global south because everyone's thinking about how we can actually grow rather than degrow. And it's easy for, as I said, people from the backgrounds like Gabriel Boric or from these sort of certain sort of Western leftist academic circles who live in big cities in apartments where they've got 10 devices plugged in, they got running water whenever they want it, they can flush the toilet whenever they want it, to say, oh well, we need to um, engineer a kind of zero growth because obviously their standard of living is already at an acceptable
So
level where
yeah,
you
it
could
would be
say
perfect to just freeze everything at this current moment right now for me in my apartment in Brooklyn. But like
exactly.
everything that like this depends on here in New York City is like if we freeze it at that level for the people that like allow electricity at the like the very if you trace to the most bottom level for electricity to come into my laptop right now, that's not a leftist or a particularly humanitarian view of the world to just sort of freeze development at their level.
Exactly. I mean, I've driven through areas here where like people, it's a lot of people in millions of people across this continent don't have regular access to electricity. They can't flush the toilet whenever they want to. There needs to be a huge amount of investment into energy infrastructure to extend access for those people. I remember years ago, Evo Morales was attacked because they were building a road connecting Cochabamba to Beni, which is an Amazonian region. And there was a massive international campaign about, they're destroying the rainforest, they're destroying the rainforest. All the communities along that path were desperately for it, were mobilizing and marching in favor of the road because they lived in communities where they basically had no schools, hospitals, because it was so difficult to get there. There was no way to bring equipment or medicines or, even equipment to build people's houses. There's no way of physically getting in there because the forest was so dense. And this road would allow people to have access to basic necessities, that allow access to internet, access to just basic medical services. And in the end, it had to be scrapped because of this sort of environmental outcry, which in the cities of Bolivia was led by the people, with 4-story houses and high speed internet and electricity whenever they need it. And of course, people don't realize that people do want development, and I think this is the transition to climate, to zero carbon or whatever. It has to be about green energy solutions, about be renewable, whatever, rather than making the poorest people in the world poorer. People never go. It's just never going to happen. And people aren't going to accept it. People are going to rise up wherever that those policies are introduced. So there has to be discussions about, for example, what Evo Morales said years ago: the climate debt that Western countries owe the global South. That the Western countries, they were able to industrialize and raise the standards of living of their population by polluting the atmosphere to a massive degree. Now the global south has the right to do that. But why can't that be done with green energy solutions? And the West should be providing the investments and the know-how for that development to be taking place in a sustainable way, because people do have a right to develop. People do have a right to have roads, to have electricity in their homes, to have running water in their homes, and to say that we just cut things off here is not acceptable to the majority of people in the world.